The night of December 18th, 1941, lay over the eastern Mediterranean like a hell breath. Above the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt, the stars were sharp and cold, scattered across the winter sky with the kind of clarity that only comes when the air is still and the sea is calm. Below them, the British Mediterranean fleet rested at anchor, the greatest concentration of Allied naval power in that theater of war. 3 battleships, 4 cruisers, 14 destroyers, supply vessels, tankers, and support ships spread across the harbor in careful, deliberate arrangement. Anti-submarine nets sealed the entrance. Armed patrol boats moved in slow, watchful circles. Hydrophone operators pressed headsets to their ears, listening for the whisper of a submarine engine beneath the black water. Searchlights swept the harbor mouth at irregular intervals, catching nothing but their own pale reflection on the surface. Everything was in order. Everything was secure. The Royal Navy had watched this harbor with professional vigilance every single night of the war. They did not know that 6 men were already inside. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They had entered the water 2 hours earlier. 6 Italian naval officers riding 3 extraordinary machines, long, torpedo-shaped devices that the men straddled like horsemen, propelled by electric motors through the darkness at a depth of several meters. They called them maiali, pigs. The name had come years earlier from the frustration of the engineers who first built them, cursing the sluggish, wallowing prototypes that refused to behave as designed. The name had stuck, even as the machines improved, because there was something faintly absurd and yet undeniably lethal about the concept. 2 men, dressed in rubber suits, riding an underwater torpedo through a guarded naval harbor in the middle of the night, carrying enough explosive to sink a battleship. The man leading the first machine that night was a 29-year-old naval lieutenant from Massa, Italy, named Luigi Duran de la Penne. He was long-limbed and quiet, with the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself to be still, to breathe slowly when the panic came, to think clearly when cold water and darkness pressed in from every side. He had trained for this moment for nearly 2 years. He had ridden the mile for the harbor at La Spezia in rehearsals so many times that the routines had become automatic, muscle memory carved by repetition. He knew the geography of Alexandria Harbor from charts and aerial photographs the way a scholar knows a text, the position of the nets, the placement of the patrol boats, the depth of the water beneath the keels of the British battleships. What he did not yet know, on that cold December night, was that within a few hours he would complete what is still regarded by historians of naval warfare as one of the most successful acts of underwater sabotage ever carried out. He would sink not 1 but 2 British battleships with a handful of men, a few homemade explosive charges, and the kind of composure under pressure that defies straightforward explanation. To understand what de la Penne and his 5 companions accomplished in Alexandria Harbor, and to understand what made their mission simultaneously an act of extraordinary courage and profound strategic irony, it is necessary to go back to the beginning of the Italian Navy's most secret program, and back further still to the particular personality of the man who made it possible. The story of Italian frogman warfare did not begin with Luigi de la Penne. It began, in a meaningful sense, with the ghost of an earlier war. During the First World War, Italy had deployed a small number of experimental underwater assault craft against the Austro-Hungarian fleet in the Adriatic. The most famous of these early operations came in November of 1918, just days before the armistice, when 2 Italian naval officers, Rafael Paolucci and Rafael Rossetti, rode a primitive torpedo device called a Magnata, or Leech, into the harbor Pulla and attached explosive charges to the hull of the Austrian dreadnought Viribus Unitas. The ship sank. The 2 Italians were captured, but they had demonstrated something that would resonate for the next 2 decades, that a small number of highly trained and highly motivated men, equipped with the right tools and possessing genuine audacity, could reach places that surface warships and submarines could not. That lesson was not forgotten. In the 1930s, as Europe moved fitfully and then rapidly toward another general war, a group of Italian naval engineers began working in secrecy on the concept that Rossetti and Paolucci had pioneered. Their program was housed at La Spezia on the Italian Riviera, under the institutional designation of the First Torpedo Flotilla, but it was known informally and eventually officially as the 10th Light Flotilla or the Decima Flottiglia MAS. The men who ran it understood that Italy, whatever its political ambitions in the Mediterranean, would enter any future conflict at a severe material disadvantage against Britain's Royal Navy. The British Mediterranean Fleet was the dominant naval power in that sea. It was better funded, better equipped, and larger than anything Italy could field in conventional surface warfare. If Italy wanted to neutralize British naval power in the Mediterranean, it would have to do so by unconventional means. The Maio, the human torpedo, was the answer they arrived at after years of engineering refinement and operator training. The device that de la Penne and his colleagues rowed into Alexandria harbor in December 1941 was a product of that long developmental history. It was approximately 6.5 meters in length, roughly the diameter of a standard Italian naval torpedo, and was powered by a 130-watt electric motor that drew current from a battery compartment housed in its central section. At maximum power, it could achieve a speed of approximately 3 knots. Its operational range was between 15 and 30 kilometers, depending on depth and current. The two operators who rowed it, seated one behind the other, wearing rubber dry suits, full-face breathing apparatus, and lead-weighted boots to maintain depth, controlled it through a joystick mechanism that governed both direction and depth. In the nose of the machine sat the warhead, a detachable charge of approximately 220 kilograms of high explosive, fitted with a time delay fuse. The entire system was designed for one purpose: to approach a target ship from underwater, slide beneath its keel, attach the warhead to hull or to the anchor chain, set the timer, and withdraw. If successful, the operators would be several miles away, or, in the most optimistic scenarios, recovered by a waiting submarine before the charge detonated. It was, in theory, an elegant system. In practice, it was a system of almost unimaginable physical and psychological demand. The men who trained to operate the Maio in the late 1930s and early 1940s were selected through a program that emphasized physical endurance, swimming ability, comfort with confined spaces, and what the program's commanders called freddezza, a kind of cold-blooded composure. De la Penne was one of those selected, and he proved to be, by every account that survives, an exceptional practitioner of the Maio. His training logs, preserved in Italian naval archives and referenced extensively by historian James J. Sakovich and others who have examined the Decima Ms records, describe a man who excelled not through physical superiority alone, but through an almost unnerving quality of calm. He needed it. The difficulties of operating the Maio in realistic training conditions were considerable. The breathing apparatus that the operators wore was an early-generation closed-circuit rebreather, a device that recycled the operator's exhale breath through a canister carbon dioxide absorbent and supplemented it with oxygen from a small bottle. This was the same technology used by the earliest generations of military divers, and it worked, but within precise limits. Below a certain depth, the elevated partial pressure of oxygen in the breathing circuit became toxic, causing sudden convulsions, loss of consciousness, and drowning. In early training exercises at La Spezia, several operators had died from oxygen toxicity, a danger that was neither fully understood nor reliably predictable. Others had been lost to equipment failure, to the disorientation of operating in black water with no visual reference, to the simple exhaustion of working in cold, heavy seas while simultaneously managing a large, unwieldy machine. By the time de la Penne completed his training and became an operational Maio commander, he had personally experienced equipment failures, navigational errors, and the particular horror of watching fellow trainees disappear beneath the surface during exercises. He had also participated in 2 earlier combat missions against British naval targets that had failed for reasons largely outside the operator's control. The first of these was the attack on Gibraltar in September of 1940, which achieved minimal results when the frogmen's machines malfunctioned before reaching the target ships. The second was a planned attack on Alexandria harbor in the spring of 1941, which was aborted when the submarine carrying the Maio teams to the target area developed mechanical problems and was forced to return to base. A third attempt on Gibraltar in May of 1941 resulted in minor damage to a British tanker, but fell far short of its ambitious objectives. Those earlier failures weighed on the men of the Decima Ms, but they also taught lessons. Each failed mission was analyzed with scrupulous attention. What had gone wrong with the breathing equipment? What navigational errors had been made? What had the patrol boats been doing at the precise moment the operators attempted to cross under the net? The program's commander, Prince Junio Valerio Borghese, a submarine captain who had transferred to the Decima MAS and whose energy and personal courage were essential to unit survival through the difficult early years, insisted on this process of systematic learning from failure. Borghese was not a man who accepted defeat as a final condition. He treated each unsuccessful mission as a problem to be solved by better preparation, better equipment, and better intelligence. By the autumn of 1941, the preparation for a new attack on Alexandria was more thorough than anything the Decima MAS had previously attempted. Italian naval intelligence had obtained detailed information about the harbor's defenses, including the position of the anti-submarine net at the harbor entrance, the patrol schedules of the guard boats, and the approximate positions of the British capital ships. The submarine Syrie, commanded by Borghese himself, would carry the 3 mile teams in sealed cylinders attached to its outer hull, approaching Alexandria submerged and releasing the operators at a predetermined distance from the harbor entrance. The 6 men selected for the mission were among the most experienced operators the Decima MAS possessed. With de la Penne on the first machine was his diver, Petty Officer Emilio Bianchi. The second machine was operated by Lieutenant Vincenzo Martellata and Petty Officer Mario Marino. The third was under the command of Captain Antonio Marseglia, accompanied by Petty Officer Spartaco Shagat. Each pair had trained together extensively. They knew each other's habits, their rhythms of work, the signals they would use in the dark water when voice communication was impossible. The mission briefing that took place aboard the Syrie in the days before the attack was precise and detailed. The 3 teams were each assigned a specific target. De la Penne and Bianchi were to attack the battleship HMS Valiant. Marseglia and Shagat would attack the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth. Martellata and Marino, whose machine was carrying a different warhead configuration, were to attach their charge to a large British tanker. The timing was coordinated so that all 3 charges would detonate within a narrow window, preventing the British from moving their ships to safety after the first explosion was heard. What no briefing could fully convey, what no amount of training or preparation could entirely simulate, was the psychological reality of the thing itself. On the evening of December 18, 1941, the Syrie surfaced several miles north of Alexandria Harbor, below the surface of a calm Mediterranean Sea. The 3 sealed cylinders on her outer hull were opened. The 6 men climbed out into black water and settled themselves onto their machines. The submarine slipped away beneath them in the darkness. With only compass bearings and the faint glow of their instrument dials to guide them, the 3 teams began moving toward the harbor lights on the horizon. What followed was among the most harrowing sequences in the documented history of special operations. The harbor entrance at Alexandria was protected by a net, a heavy steel mesh barrier suspended from floats, and designed to stop exactly the kind of underwater approach that the Mael teams were attempting. Getting through the net was one of the central problems that the Decima MAS planners had grappled with during the mission's preparation. The solution they had arrived at was an opportunistic one. Rather than cutting the net, the operators would wait near the entrance for one of the British patrol vessels to pass through the gate, and they would follow in its wake, diving deep to pass beneath the submerged portion of the net as the gate swung open. This required a level of timing and nerve that is difficult to fully convey in words. De la Penne brought his machine to the harbor entrance and waited. British guard boats moved in their regular patterns above and around him. The searchlights swept the water surface. Beneath them, in cold, dark water that smelled of engine oil and harbor sediment, he held his mile at depth and waited for his opportunity. It came in the early hours of December 19th, when a group of British destroyers began moving through the harbor entrance gate. De la Penne took his machine forward and passed through in their turbulent wake, staying low, staying slow, trusting the noise of the destroyer propellers to cover whatever sound his own small motor was making. He was inside. The British battleship HMS Valiant lay at anchor ahead of him. She displaced nearly 31,000 tons. Her hull was armored with belt plate that ranged from several centimeters to over 30 centimeters in thickness. She carried 8 15-inch guns and 4 twin turrets. She was, in virtually every material sense, impervious to the kind of weapons that surface warfare could bring to bear against a ship in a defended harbor. What she was not impervious to was a particular vulnerability of all ships that lie at anchor, the thin steel of their lower hull plating below the waterline, exposed to whatever might approach from the deep. De la Penne drove his machine toward the Valiant hull and began his approach run. Then, in the cold darkness below the keel of one of the Royal Navy's most powerful battleships, the machine failed. The problem was a net, not the harbor entrance net, but a separate anti-torpedo net that had been strung beneath the Valiant's hull. De la Penne's Mael became entangled in it. In the struggle to free the machine, his diver Bianchi was struck, lost consciousness, and rose to the surface, where he was spotted by the British and pulled from the water. De la Penne was now alone, in black water, beneath a battleship, with a machine that would not move, a missing partner, and a detached warhead on the harbor bottom beneath him. What happened next is the moment around which the entire story turns. He did not retreat. He did not surface and surrender. He had no functioning transport, no diver, no way to ride the machine into position. The warhead was on the harbor bottom, approximately 1.5 meters below the keel of the Valiant. It was not where it needed to be to guarantee the maximum destructive effect that the mission planners had intended. Luigi de la Penne removed himself from his machine. Alone, in the dark, breathing from his rebreather in careful measured intervals, he began pushing the warhead by hand along the harbor bottom, through the silt and muck and the loose debris of a working harbor, directly beneath the keel of the ship. It took him approximately 40 minutes to cover a distance that a man could walk on dry land in less than a minute. He was working in near total darkness, with limited visibility, breathing from equipment that could kill him without warning if he pushed too deep. He attached the charge. He set the timer. Then, exhausted, lungs burning, he surfaced alongside the hull of the Valiant and was immediately captured by the British. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He was taken aboard the Valiant herself, where a British officer, aware that Italian frogmen had been in the harbor, having already captured Bianchi and received reports of suspicious activity from other areas, asked him directly whether he had placed a charge beneath the ship. De la Penne said nothing. He was asked again. He was threatened with death. He was placed in confinement below decks, in the forward section of the ship, which was, as the British interrogating officer almost certainly understood, precisely where an explosive charge beneath the keel would deliver its greatest destructive effect. It was an implicit ultimatum. If the charge went off, de la Penne would go with it. He said nothing. At approximately 5:50 in the morning of December 19th, 1941, with perhaps 15 minutes left on the timer, de la Penne asked to speak to the Valiant's commander. He was taken to the captain's quarters. He told the officer that a charge was about to explode beneath the ship, that there was no longer time to find and remove it, and that the crew should be brought up from below decks to minimize casualties. He gave no other information. He would not reveal the location of the charge, the size of the charge, or any other detail that might have permitted the British to act more effectively. He offered his warning solely on the grounds that there was now nothing the British could do to save their ship, and that the deaths of ordinary sailors who had no involvement in the strategic contest between the two navies served no purpose that he could defend himself. At 6:05 in the morning, the charge exploded. The explosion beneath HMS Valiant was not the dramatic, cinematic detonation that later popular accounts sometimes suggested. There was no great column of fire rising into the Alexandria sky, no instantaneous catastrophe of the kind that a surface torpedo strike might produce. What happened was at once more subtle and, from an engineering standpoint, far more devastating. The charge had been positioned directly beneath the forward section of the battleship's keel. When it detonated, the energy of approximately 220 kilograms of high explosive was channeled upward to the water column, in what naval engineers call an underwater shock wave, a phenomenon distinctly different from explosion in open air. Water does not compress the way air does. It transmits the energy of an explosion almost without loss, driving it through the ship's hull plating in a hammer blow that could not be absorbed, deflected, or outrun. The Valiant's armored belt, her heavy turret faces, her reinforced conning tower, none of these mattered in the slightest. The charge had been placed below all of them, against the unarmored underbody of the ship, and the water had done the rest. The keel buckled, Flooding began immediately in the forward sections. The ship settled into the harbor mud, listing slightly, her great guns pointing uselessly at the Egyptian sky. HMS Valiant was out of the war, but de la Penne had not been alone in the harbor that night. At almost precisely the same moment, a second explosion rolled across the still water of Alexandria Harbor. It came from the far side of the anchorage, where the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth lay at her moorings. Captain Antonio Marseglia and Petty Officer Spartaco Shiget had reached their target without the catastrophic equipment failure that had plagued de la Penne's approach. They had placed their charge cleanly beneath the Queen Elizabeth's keel, set the timer, and withdrawn. They were already moving through the harbor toward their planned extraction point when the charge detonated. The result was nearly identical to what had happened to the Valiant. The Queen Elizabeth's keel was ruptured. Flooding began. The ship settled into the harbor bottom, her lower decks taking water. Her machinery spaces threatened, her fighting capability instantly and dramatically reduced. The flagship of the British Mediterranean Fleet, the ship from whose deck Admiral Andrew Cunningham had commanded the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean, was sitting on the bottom of Alexandria Harbor. Both British battleships had been put out of action in the space of a single morning. The third charge, placed by Martellata and Marino, had detonated beneath a Norwegian tanker called the Sigona, which was carrying a full cargo of fuel oil. The Sigona was badly damaged. The destroyer HMS Jervis, which had been moored alongside the tanker, was also damaged by the explosion. She would require repairs before returning to service. In the span of a few hours, with 6 men and 3 machines, the Decima MAS had effectively neutralized British naval superiority in the eastern Mediterranean. To appreciate the full strategic significance of what happened at Alexandria Harbor on the morning of December 19, 1941, it is necessary to understand the specific moment at which it occurred, because the timing of the raid was not incidental. It was everything. The autumn and early winter of 1941 had been a period of acute crisis in the Mediterranean theater. Germany's Afrika Korps, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been driving eastward across the North African desert with a speed and aggression that continually outpaced British planning and logistics. The supply lines that sustained Rommel's advance ran primarily by sea, from Italian ports across the central Mediterranean to the North African coast, and those supply lines were the point of maximum British vulnerability. Every convoy that reached North Africa with fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements extended Rommel's reach. Every convoy that was intercepted and sunk shortened it. The British Mediterranean Fleet was the primary instrument of that interdiction. Surface warships and submarines operating from Malta and Alexandria had been attacking Axis convoys with considerable effect in the months before the Alexandria raid. In October and November 1941, the loss rate among Italian and German convoys crossing the Mediterranean had reached levels that were strategically unsustainable. Rommel's army was beginning to run short of fuel. His offensive capability was being drained not by British armor in the desert, which had repeatedly proven unable to match the Afrika Korps in mobile warfare, but by the Royal Navy's patient, relentless work against the supply lines. The 2 battleships that de la Penne and his colleagues disabled on December 19th were the backbone of that effort. Without HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, the British Mediterranean Fleet lost its ability to operate confidently in the central Mediterranean against the Italian battle fleet. The Italian Navy, aware of the damage that had been done, moved its own capital ships forward. The supply convoys to North Africa became substantially safer. Rommel received the fuel and ammunition he needed. The connection between 6 Italian frogmen in Alexandria Harbor and the subsequent advance of German armor across the desert toward Egypt is not a simple, direct line of cause and effect. History rarely works that cleanly, but the removal of the 2 British battleships from the strategic equation at precisely that moment contributed materially to the conditions that allowed Rommel to pursue his most ambitious offensive. By the summer of 1942, German and Italian forces had advanced to El Alamein, within 60 miles of Alexandria itself. The same harbor, the same water, where de la Penne had pushed a warhead to the silt in the dark 9 months earlier. There is a layer of this story that goes beyond the operational and strategic, and it concerns what de la Penne did aboard HMS Valiant in those final minutes before the charge detonated. He had been captured. He had been interrogated. He had been taken below decks and placed in the section of the ship most likely to be destroyed by the explosion he had himself set in motion. All of that had failed to produce a single word of useful intelligence. He had maintained silence with completeness and consistency that, by the accounts of the British officers present, was not the silence of man suppressing information under duress, but rather the silence of man who had thought through the situation and made a clear moral decision about what he would and would not say. And then, with minutes remaining, he had asked to speak to the captain and warned him to clear the lower decks. This detail sits at the center of the Alexandria story and resists simple categorization. It was not the act of a man who had broken under pressure and decided to cooperate. He gave nothing away, no location, no detail, no information that would have helped the British save their ship or identify his colleagues, two of whom were still at large in harbor. The warning he gave was strategically worthless to the British and cost the WWII nothing. What it did was give the ordinary sailors aboard HMS Valiant a chance to survive. The British naval community recognized the distinction. When the war ended and it became possible to look back at the events of December 19th, 1941, with something approaching impartiality, the question of how to characterize de La Penne's conduct generated serious discussion at the highest levels of the Royal Navy. He had attacked a ship in a defended harbor and put her on the harbor bottom. He had done so using a weapon and a method that his opponents had not, at that stage of the war, been able to counter effectively. He had refused to provide information that would have been operationally significant. He had, by every conventional measure, inflicted a serious military defeat on the forces he had been sent to fight. He had also ensured that as many of the men aboard that ship as possible would be alive to see the end of the war. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, who had watched his flagship settle into the harbor bottom on the morning of the raid, and who had then spent months conducting an elaborate deception operation to conceal the extent of the damage from Axis intelligence, maintaining normal radio traffic from the Queen Elizabeth, keeping the ship's hulls above the waterline by careful management of their flooding, so that aerial reconnaissance would show them apparently intact at their moorings, later wrote with control but evident respect about the quality of the operation his opponents had conducted. He described it as a brilliant feat of arms. What he did not say, in his published memoirs, was what it had cost him. The Queen Elizabeth and the Valiant were out of action for months. The Queen Elizabeth would not return to full operational service until the summer of 1943, a year and a half after the charge beneath her keel went off. The Valiant was repaired more quickly, returning to limited service by the spring of 1942, but she was never fully restored to her pre-raid condition during the Mediterranean campaign. For the critical period of late 1941 through the summer of 1942, the period that would determine whether Rommel reached the Suez Canal or was stopped short of it, the British Mediterranean Fleet operated without its two most powerful surface units. The 6 men of the Alexandria raid were all captured. De La Penne and Bianchi had been taken from the water. Marseglia and Chagat had successfully exited the harbor after placing their charge, making their way to a prearranged rendezvous point on the Alexandria waterfront disguised as French sailors. But they had been arrested the following day before the planned submarine recovery could be completed. Martellata and Marino were captured while attempting to exit the harbor. All 6 were held as prisoners of war in Egypt. They were treated by all surviving accounts with the courtesy that the British services traditionally extended to captured officers, though that courtesy had certain firm limits when it came to questions of intelligence about the WWII, its methods, and its future operations. On those subjects, the 6 men maintained the same collective silence that de La Penne had demonstrated alone aboard the Valiant. Borghese, commanding the Syrie, had received no signal confirming that the operation had succeeded. The operators had no means of transmitting from within the harbor, but the detonations had been audible, and when the submarine reached a recovery point and found no men waiting, Borghese understood what had happened. He brought the Syrie home to La Spezia without her operators. The news of the raid's success did not reach the Italian Naval Command immediately, partly because the British went to extraordinary lengths to suppress it. Cunningham's deception operation, the maintenance of normal communications from the damaged ships, the careful management of their visible profile from the air, worked well enough that Axis intelligence initially believed the British battleships remained operational. The full extent of the damage was not confirmed by Italian intelligence until weeks later. When it was confirmed, the reaction within the Decima MAS and within the Italian Navy more broadly was one of intense, complicated pride. The unit had achieved something that conventional naval warfare had been unable to accomplish: the neutralization of British battleship superiority in the eastern Mediterranean through an operation that had cost the Italians exactly 0 ships, 0 submarines, and 6 men, all of whom were alive, if imprisoned. The deeper historical irony of the Alexandria raid, the one that tends to emerge most clearly when you look at it from the distance of more than 8 decades, is not strategic but human. Luigi della Penne had been trained by a system designed to produce men capable of aggressive, lethal, self-sacrificing action against the enemy. The Decima MAS was not a gentle institution. It had been shaped by the particular military culture of fascist Italy, which placed enormous rhetorical emphasis on violence, sacrifice, and the subordination of individual judgment to the demands of the state. The program's early training had killed men. Its combat missions had killed men. The entire conceptual apparatus within which della Penne operated was one that treated death, his own death, his opponent's deaths, as an acceptable and even desirable instrument of policy. And yet, in the moment of his greatest operational success, when he had the British battleship's crew entirely at his mercy and no force on earth could stop the charge from going off, he chose to warn them. He was not, in any bureaucratic or institutional sense, required to do so. There was no provision in his mission orders for warning the enemy. There was no code, no convention, no superior authority present to instruct him. He made the decision himself, alone, in the captured officers' quarters of the ship he had just sunk, with a few minutes left on a timer he had set with his own hands. The question of why, of what precisely moved him to offer that warning, is one that historians and biographers have approached with some care, because della Penne himself was not, in later years, given to elaborate self-analysis on the subject. He was characteristically understated when asked about it. He had placed his charge. He had done his duty. The battle was over at that point, and killing sailors who had nothing to do with the larger strategic contest served no purpose he could identify. That, approximately, was his explanation. It is a soldier's answer. Spare, practical, devoid of sentiment, and it is, perhaps for those very reasons, completely convincing. After the war ended, in the changed world of 1945 and beyond, a sequence of events occurred that is almost too neat to be believed, and yet is thoroughly documented. Luigi della Penne had spent the later years of the war in circumstances that had undergone a decisive change. Italy had capitulated to the Allies in September of 1943. And with that capitulation, the men of the Decima MAS found themselves in an extraordinarily ambiguous position. Some elements of the unit continued fighting alongside the Germans in the German-occupied north of Italy. Others, and della Penne was among them, transferred their allegiance to the Allied cause and offered their skills to the forces now fighting to liberate the Italian peninsula. Della Penne served with the Allied-aligned Italian naval forces in the final phase of the war, conducting underwater operations against German shipping and harbor facilities in the northern Adriatic. He was, in the most literal sense, applying the same skills and the same equipment to the service of his former enemies that he had previously deployed against them. In 1945, with the war in Europe concluded, the British government was faced with the question of how to formally recognize the actions of men who had attacked their ships at Alexandria. The question was not simple. These were men who had operated against the Royal Navy in combat. They had put 2 battleships on the harbor bottom. They had, by any reasonable measure, inflicted one of the most humiliating single operational defeats that the Royal Navy had suffered in the entire war. They had also, every one of them, conducted themselves throughout their captivity and afterward with professional integrity that their former opponents could not help but recognize and, in a certain sense, respect. The decision that was reached, it was a decision that required authorization at the highest levels of the British naval establishment, was to award Luigi Durand della Penne the Italian Gold Medal for Military Valor, Italy's highest military decoration, in a ceremony aboard an Italian naval vessel. The officer who pinned the medal to della Penne's chest was Admiral Sir Charles Morgan. Admiral Morgan had commanded HMS Valiant on the morning of December 19, 1941. He was the man to whom della Penne had been brought in those final minutes before the explosion. He was a man who had heard della Penne's warning, or the crew up from below decks, and then stood on the quarterdeck as a charge went off beneath his ship's keel. The two men stood facing each other, the Italian who had sunk the ship and the Englishman who had commanded it, in what was by any measure one of the stranger ceremonial moments in the long and complicated history of the Mediterranean War. The Alexandria raid did not by itself determine the outcome of the North African campaign. History does not operate through single events, however dramatic. The battles at El Alamein in the autumn of 1942 that stopped Rommel's advance were won by the collective effort of hundreds of thousands of men, by the logistics revolution that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery imposed on the Eighth Army, by the air power that the Allies were finally able to concentrate over the desert, and by the simple, grinding material superiority that American industrial production was beginning to make available to the Allied cause. But the Alexandria raid did something that conventional assessments of the Mediterranean campaign sometimes undervalue. It demonstrated, at a moment when the outcome of the war in that theater was genuinely uncertain, that the resources and will of one side were not the only variables in the equation. A small, highly trained, highly motivated force, operating with the right tools and the right intelligence and the right quality of human courage, could reach inside the most carefully defended anchorage in the eastern Mediterranean and alter the strategic balance with 6 men and 3 machines. That lesson was not lost on the Allies. The British Special Boat Service, the American Office of Strategic Services Maritime Units, and the various other underwater warfare programs that the Western Allies developed and expanded throughout the remainder of the war drew directly and explicitly on the lessons of the Decima MAS. The Mael, the Pig, had demonstrated a concept of underwater offensive warfare that would shape naval special operations for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The men who developed and refined that concept, who trained through failure and loss and the particular terror of breathing borrowed air in black water under keel an enemy ship, those men had invented something, not just a weapon or a tactic, but proof of principle, that the right combination of technical ingenuity, physical courage, and moral clarity, in the hands of the right men, could accomplish things that no admiral's fleet plan had anticipated. Luigi Durand de la Penne lived until 1992, long enough to see the Cold War he had helped shape through the precedents of the Alexandria raid come to its own conclusion. In the last decades of his life, he was occasionally sought out by historians and journalists who wanted to discuss what he had done on the night of December 18th and the morning of December 19th, 1941. He tended to deflect the grander interpretations. He had done his job. His colleagues had done theirs. The machines had worked well enough. The night had been calm, and the British had been, as he put in one of his more expansive moments, admirably professional about the whole business. He was asked more than once about the warning, about what had moved him in those final minutes aboard the Valiant, to tell the British captain to clear his men from the lower decks. His answers never varied much. There was no longer any military purpose served by keeping the sailors in the path of the explosion. The battle had already been decided. Killing those men would have been, in his own word, inutile, useless. It is a word that cuts in more than one direction. Useless killing. Killing that serves no strategic or operational purpose. Killing for its own sake is a concept that sits at the center of every serious attempt to think about the ethics of warfare. De la Penne was not a philosopher and did not present himself as one, but the principle he applied in the officers' quarters of HMS Valiant in the pre-dawn darkness of December 19th, 1941, was as close as a soldier in the middle of a war is likely to come to a statement of moral conviction. He had done what the mission required. He had not done what the mission did not require. The 2 battleships settled into the mud of Alexandria Harbor. The Mediterranean War went on, and 6 men who had ridden pig-shaped machines through a defended harbor in the dark went to prisoner of war camps and eventually came home, carrying with them the knowledge of what it cost to do what they had done and what it meant, both the doing and the restraint. The harbor at Alexandria is quiet now. The ships are long gone, raised and repaired, and eventually scrapped in the ordinary way of things. The water where de la Penne pushes warhead through the silt is the same water that laps at the harbor walls today, green in the daylight, black at night, indifferent to the precise weight of what happened beneath it 8 decades ago. But history keeps its own accounts. And on the ledger of the Second World War's most consequential small actions, those moments where the courage and judgment of a handful of people altered something that 1,000 conventional soldiers could not have reached, the name of that harbor, and the name of the man who sank a battleship alone in the dark and then warned his enemies to save their lives belongs near the very top of the list. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.